Hello, students. My name is Deepta Vivekanand, and I'm going to talk to you about The Address by Dutch writer Marga Minko. That's chapter number 2 of Snapshots in the NCERT Supplementary Reader for Class 11, English Core. This is part 1. In this podcast, the objective is to give you an insight into the life and works of the author Marga Minko, to walk you through the historical background against which the story is told, and to explain the story itself along with its nuances. Right, so it'll be great now if you can all turn to page 10. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about Marga Minko. Because you see, understanding her story is central to understanding The Address. Through her personal story, we get to understand her writing style and her choice of subject. Marga Minko was born Sarah Minko. She was born to Orthodox Jewish parents in the year 1920 in the Netherlands. As a young girl, she moved to Breda, a town near her birthplace, together with her parents and her 2 siblings. You could say that Marga Minko was a bit of a rebel in her younger days. She didn't quite enjoy attending Jewish ceremonies. She often wondered what made her different from the other non-Jewish children and wished to stay as inconspicuous as they. In 1938, she started her career as a journalist with a local newspaper. But in 1940, she was fired because Hitler's Nazi party had decreed that all Jews must be excluded from public life. She then went to Amsterdam, where she started offering drawing lessons to children at a Jewish elementary school. Her family, who soon joined her in Amsterdam, were forced to move to the Jewish quarter. I'm assuming now that you already know from your history lessons in class 10 about the atrocities that were meted out to the Jews during World War II. I'd like you to recall that. And you have perhaps also read The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. Do you remember that one? You see, almost every Jewish family suffered inexplicable horrors during that time. And it was no different with Marga's family. Her sister Betty was arrested in Amsterdam during one of the first roundups, and her brother Dave was arrested on his way to a place of hiding. When Marga and her parents were picked up to be deported from their home, she managed to escape through the back door. She then went on to bleach her hair and went into hiding and started using a forged identity card. Imagine having to live with a fake identity and constantly having to fear for your life. So Marga then stayed in a house with some other artists and students. Her colleague, Bert Wheaton, joined her later. Marga would go on to marry Wheaton in 1945. Her family members, however, never came back from the concentration camps. They all died between 1942 and 1944. Can you picture those traumatic times? It was these horrific experiences of her youth that inspired her to start writing novels and formed the common motif in all her books. Marga started writing short stories in newspapers and magazines in the early 1950s. Her first novel came out in 1957, and it was called Bitter Herbs. That's the English name, of course. She wrote in Dutch. The book was about the painful experiences of a young girl during World War II. It went on to win several awards and made Minko one of the most powerful voices in the world of Holocaust literature. She's known for her crisp and sober writing style while artfully weaving complex emotions into the narrative. I hope this gives you a little background about the author. In fact, Marga Minko just turned 100 in March. God bless her. So, with that, we can now move on to the story itself. Like I said earlier, much of Marga Minko's writing is influenced by her experiences as a survivor of Nazi atrocities. And this story also has the same flavor. The narrator, a young woman, goes to a house on Marconi Street, door number 46. We don't know the character's name till the end. This is again a recurring motif in many of Marga Minko's stories. A woman opens the door. "Do you still know me?" asks the narrator. "No, I don't," says the woman. The narrator comes up one more step to make sure the woman gets a better look of her. She identifies herself as Mrs. S.'s daughter, but the woman pretends not to recognize her. But then the narrator catches a glimpse of the green sweater that the woman is wearing, and she immediately recognizes that it is her mother's sweater, and she is now certain that she has indeed come to the right house. The woman notices the narrator looking at her sweater, and she realizes she can't pretend anymore. But she's still reluctant to have a conversation with the narrator or let her into the house. The narrator goes on to ask, "You knew my mother?" Have you come back?" said the woman. "I thought no one had come back." "Only me," says the narrator. At this point, it may be still unclear to you, the reader, as to what's going on, but just think back to the historical background I gave you and the writer's style that I spoke about. And if you put these two together, you could conclude that the reference is to the narrator's family being taken away to concentration camps during the war. Now, the woman, she assumes none of the family survived the Holocaust, and the narrator then clarifies that only she survived. We must pause and wonder here if Minko is indeed the narrator of this story, considering she too was the only survivor in her family. Could this therefore be a personal story, or at least inspired by her own life? Let's move on. The woman is clearly discomfited by this turn of events, and she does not want to engage with the narrator any further. She hurriedly sends the narrator away, saying she can't help her with anything. As the narrator walks out, perplexed, she takes a quick look at the door number just to make sure she came to the right address. Number 46, it says, and the name of the family, Dorling, is written too. The narrator is now convinced that it's the right address and that the woman was deliberately keeping her away. On her way back to the train station, the narrator's mind is flooded with thoughts about the past. If you can now, students, please go to page 11. I'd like to read out a small portion. As I walked slowly back to the station, I thought about my mother, who had given me the address years ago. It had been in the first half of the war. I was home for a few days, and it struck me immediately that something or the other about the rooms had changed. I missed various things. My mother was surprised I should have noticed so quickly. She then told me about Mrs. Dorling. I had never heard of her, but apparently she was an old acquaintance of my mother, whom she hadn't seen for years. She had suddenly turned up and renewed their contact. Since then, she had come regularly. Every time she leaves here, she takes something home with her, said my mother. She took all the table silver in one go, and then the antique plates that hung there. She had trouble lugging those large vases. I'm worried she got a crick in her back from the crockery. Now it all begins to make sense to the reader. Mrs. Dorling, the woman who lived at number 46 Marconi Street, was a friend of the narrator's mother. Mrs. Dorling begins to take all their household articles little by little to her house under the garb of saving them, should the narrator's family be rounded up by the Gestapo or Hitler's secret state police and taken to concentration camps. The narrator's mother trusts her friend Mrs. Dorling and assumes all their things would be safe with her, although the narrator is not convinced about Mrs. Dorling's intentions. This is end of part 1.